Welcome back to another episode of Garrett Garage. My name is Austin, and welcome to episode number 2. On this week's video, I'm going to be working on getting the orbital for the full hydraulic steering mounted. On last week's video, I got the support tubes for the coilover mounts in place. Those are the diagonal tubes you see to the left and right of where I'm working now. Structurally, they're very important. However, they create a bit of a headache when routing the steering column because it doesn't give me a straight shot from where it comes through the firewall to where I plan to mount the orbital. Typically, when I'm starting a new part design, I begin with a couple of rough measurements and a general idea of what the shape will be. But as I'm getting that shape roughed out, I'm not hyper fixating on what those final dimensions or shapes will end up being. So here you can see me kind of starting with a generic tab. I knew I wanted to add a bend in this bracket so that I was able to key off of the tube that it will be mounting to. This will both locate the bracket relative to the tube as well as add a little extra strength because you're going to be welding on more than one plane. Final step here is doing a test bend in Fusion 360 to make sure the part looks how I want. Everything looks good, and now we're ready to process the G-code and get it over to the CNC plasma. Most of you won't know me well enough yet to know this, but I am a deep lover of side projects. This DIY CNC table is no exception. I plan to introduce this in a little bit more detail in a future video, but in short, this is a spin-off of the JD's Garage DIY CNC plasma table plans. I purchased his plans and modified some of the parts to work better for me, but all of the blue parts that you see there are 3D printed. I collected all of the CNC components to put together the control cabinet and the frame all from scratch. And I dimensioned the table to fit my garage and my needs, but you could modify his plans to build essentially as big or small of a table as works for you. One of the recurring themes you're going to notice on all the scenes where I'm running the CNC plasma is that I keep that Xbox controller close at hand. I have this controller programmed with a couple of shortcuts through the cutting software that allow me to move the gantry, but most importantly hit the E-stop. So this way I can watch, and if my ground is set incorrectly or if the G-code was processed incorrectly, I can hit the E-stop and hopefully save that piece of material. Up next, we're going to do the layout on our part for the bend line that we drew in Fusion 360. I like to make these bend lines key off of a square face at a 90-degree angle if at all possible. It makes the use of a speed square the most quick and accurate way to lay that line out. Then we're going to bring it over to the Swag finger brake. I love this thing. This is a DIY kit through Swag Off-Road. And if you take your time and you do it manually, you can have pretty repeatable and accurate bends. Just a little bit later, we got that bracket that I just made tacked up to the support tube. The Heim joint is in place, and that's now supporting the steering column, keeping that from wobbling around or touching anything it shouldn't. We've got clearance to all of the surrounding parts. And most importantly, everything spins freely. Continuing on with our mock-up, the next step was to cut down another small chunk of steering shaft and adding the second universal joint. The stacking of these two universal joints is what allows us to jog that shaft around the support tube that we need to avoid. I've got my mock-up orbital in place roughly where I want it to go, and I've slapped an angle finder on there to try to roughly gauge what angle I want that orbital at so that the fittings have clearance to the front support tube, as well as how much height I need to add to my original orbital mount bracket that I had drawn for a base point. Here you can see the now modified orbital bracket. This has now got the mounting angle and the added height that I determined from our last step during mockup. I was just editing a drawing that I had already made, so you don't get the cool montage of me making it from scratch, but here you can see me flattening it, orienting it on the vertical plane, and getting the G-code process so that the CNC knows what to cut. Looks like we got another successful cut. Everything's looking good. Gonna get that cleaned up real quick. Go do our layout lines for the bend we gotta add. And I would say at this point, we're pretty much past the point of any concern. We're just gonna run this down on the press brake until we get it to 90 degrees, bolt it onto our orbital, and we should be ready to tack this sucker in and be done with this project. Fuck. I bent it the wrong way. Okay, I don't know if this is gonna work, but I saw it on this old Tony video. If you just bend it really hard... Nope, never mind. Wait a second, though. I've never noticed that switch before on my drill press, but that may just be the ticket. Just gonna pop it in the vise here and... probably should make sure it's centered under that spindle. All right. Here goes nothing. Okay. All right. Where were we? I'm so glad that worked. That was way easier than having to remake that whole part. So now that it's oriented the correct direction, I'm just going to bolt it up to the mock-up orbital, take all of this over to the truck and get it reinstalled, and we should be nearing the end of the mock-up brackets and bits and tidbits and stuff and bits and things. That works. That'll do. There. Something like that. Need a light. All right, so clearance behind here, clearance to all the fittings. These big fittings are actually on the back side of the tube. And most importantly, nothing hits. All right, and there you have it. So got the orbital bracket tacked in. That required a little bit more fine tuning to get it how I want, but looks like with the Heim joint and the W joint, the steering is able to jog around the support tube we put in. I still have access to all of the surrounding accessories, so I can get the nut on top of the bump stop can, as well as access the tensioning bolt for the alternator bracket. So those were kind of my two requirements. I'm fairly certain that I have room to route my hoses on the top of the orbital around that support tube. But I just put the smallest tack in place for the time being to allow myself to tweak that bracket in the future. But now I can get rid of all my clamps and move on to full welding of the surrounding parts. So next step is going to be fully welding in the support tubes that I was kind of working around. I like where those sit. Looks like everything's going to work out. But I will leave the orbital mounting bracket just tacked for the time being. Anything that is going to be sort of related to other things that might prevent it from working properly in the future, I'm just leaving tacked. So the full hydro ram is just tacked, orbital mount is just tacked. basically any accessory brackets and stuff like that. We'll just leave tacked until everything is exactly how we want and we're able to flex test it and route lines and make sure that everything's gonna work. But for this time, it's been a long weekend, so thank you for watching. My name is Austin, and this is Garrett Garage.